Should we start? Oh, I'm on the mic now. Whoa. Okay. So now I'm weirdly loud, but thank you all for being here and being interested in card payments and learning a little bit about how this particular payment rail works. Just to give you a kind of a sense of what we're going to cover, it's a pretty one-on-one talk. So for those of you who are already deep in the card payment space, hopefully you'll get something out of it, but it is much more of, figuring out exactly how this ecosystem is laid out, what happens to a transaction as it moves through this entire ecosystem. So that's kind of what we'll be talking about. And then I'll explore a little bit of special topics or innovation happening across this space. So first, a little bit about who I am. Hi, I'm Pritee. I'm the head of product at Lithic. We're a developer-first issuer processor. Nick is also here. He's an engineer on our API team. Before this, I was at Plaid, Coinbase, and Google before that. So that's a little bit about me. So I'll start by sort of level setting, like why are we even talking about card payments? What's interesting about card payments? As you know from my previous experience at Coinbase, I also have an interest in crypto. So especially for those of you who are thinking, isn't crypto the future? Why are we still in card payments? There's a lot of advantages that I think card payments are pretty uniquely positioned to deliver on. One, they're ubiquitous, especially in the US market, especially post-pandemic. Almost everyone is accepting card payments, right? So you rarely see that form of really almost universal acceptance in a card payment, in a payment type. The second point is high uptime, low latency. So this is particularly, in some crypto use cases, you don't really get this. Similarly with ACH, the latency of waiting, up to 3 days for an ACH payment to go through. With card payments, that's pretty much instant, and we'll go into why that is and how that works. The third point is payment guarantees. So this is kind of in contrast to checks, which could bounce, have no guarantees. The way that this whole network is set up is actually pretty advantageous for merchants. So they have a pretty reasonable expectation of being paid at the end of the day. And then the fourth one is the availability of credit. I've talked to some of you at this conference about buy now, pay later just exploding in growth. I think this was the original buy now, pay later a few decades ago, and the availability of credit to mass market is a huge advantage still. Of this payment type. And then the final point here is scale and velocity. So, this is something where I actually just looked up this number because I was like, oh, what is the scale of card payments in the US? And the value is actually in the trillions, and the number of payments is in the hundreds of billions. So it is almost unrivaled in terms of scale and velocity. But we're trying to provide a balanced perspective here, so why not card payments? There are a lot of intermediaries. So one of the things that we'll talk about in this talk is who are all the parties in the ecosystem? And I'm going to lay out a very kind of plain vanilla use case here, and you'll see there's already in that plain vanilla use case a number of parties. It can be even more than that. And what that results in is it is somewhat opaque. Right? Each one of these folks has their own rules, there's a lot of regulation, their own fees, their own setup processes, so it can make for a somewhat opaque payment network system. And then the final one is, many of you may be familiar with Interchange, but basically there is often a transaction value-based fee associated with this, which can really stack up for large purchases. So then, we're here to understand how card payments work. Why would we want to do that? I say very often infrastructure matters. And, just building and then thinking of how the back end works as an afterthought can often be pretty dangerous. And this is especially true, I think, in card payments. And as we'll go through the ecosystem, you'll see there's numerous points for innovation here. And that innovation in infrastructure, I think, is driving a lot of the innovation downstream. So one of the coolest parts, I think, of being at Lithic for me has been seeing what our customers are building on top of our platform. But that's just for me. I think that applies across the ecosystem as well. So that's the third point, is novel use cases, I think, are emerging in this area. All right, the card payment ecosystem is broadly broken up into two main sides. Okay, so on the left-hand side, there's the acquiring side. The way I remember this personally is they're acquiring the money. So they're the seller in any of these transactions, but it actually, I think, predates to when independent sales organizations and banks were acquiring merchants. So it's not actually acquiring money, but that's how I think about it. So on this left-hand side, you have the merchant. And they are, say, a coffee shop, or it could be an online retailer. This is mostly, I've set it up as a physical point of sale type of example, but it could be anything. They are then using a Square dongle, say, if they're a food truck, or a Toast point of sale if they're a restaurant. There's a lot of, those are two of the newer hardware systems, but there's tons. I think we've all seen various hardware at different merchants. That piece of hardware is then connected to a technology backend, and that's the acquire processor. So, there's different ways to set this up where the point of sale may also be the acquire processor, but traditionally they have been separate parts of this ecosystem. And then there's the merchant bank that's sort of behind all of this. So for a merchant to actually accept card payments, they have to have some bank behind them. That's where they will eventually get the dollars for whatever coffee they sold. It has to go somewhere. And so they have a merchant bank, also often called an acquiring bank, if you hear that term as well. In the middle of all of this is the card networks. There are many more than the two you see here, but these are the two most common in the US, Visa and MasterCard. We'll go into some of the specifics of what the role of the networks is, but I'm continually surprised by how much they influence or dictate various other parts of this broader network. Then on the issuing side, this is basically everyone, I like to think of it as when I get issued a new credit card, I'm really excited to spend on it. And so I think of it really as the consumers and businesses that are being issued cards. And so there's those consumers and businesses, then there's an issuer processor. Basically, that's the analogous to the acquirer processor, the technology layer there. And then behind everything has to sit a issuing bank. So they're, again, alluding to how much power banks also have in this ecosystem. To make all of this go round, there has to be a bank that is then going to send money to the merchant bank. So we'll get into the flow of funds. There's two main ways that this plays out. So, many of you may have like a Chase Sapphire card, and you see really heavy Chase branding on that. It's blue, Chase's logo is all over it, and it's very clear to think about Chase as the issuer. That makes a lot of sense. There's another model in which, maybe you have a company and you are issuing cards to contractors or employees in some way. And actually, the branding that you want is your own company's branding. And so in that case, you may have a sponsor bank. Their branding is still, their name is still present on the physical card, but their branding is not all over it. And so we talk about the issuer processor being kind of the program manager. That issuer processor doing a lot more in creating, distributing, and processing these card payments. So there's two main roles that an issuing bank can play. One much more prominent, one much more in the background there. Okay, so I tend to throw out a lot of words, and then I remember that I haven't defined them at all. So this is the kind of the glossary for what we're going to go through. The PAN is the primary account number. This is the full 16 digits that you see on your card. This is a pretty sensitive number, so when you think about what you can and can't store, there's a lot of compliance there. But that's what's commonly referred to as PAN. Then there's a CVV. This is the 3, sometimes 4 digits on the back of your card that you're often used to putting into online transactions. Then there's the MCC, the merchant category code. So we'll go into things like how is Interchange set, what is in the messages that are transmitted across the system. But one of the main piece of information is the merchant category code. And it really matters, if you're a merchant, it really matters what your merchant category code is. It determines a lot of the economics that will happen in the transactions that you accept. Then there's the merchant discount rate, the interchange. Both of these are basically referring to the fees that goes to the various parties in the slide I just showed. If you buy a $100 purchase at a merchant, they'll get $97 or $98 of that. The other $2 or $3 are split between the various folks in this ecosystem. So that's what that is referring to. Card not present, this is a really important distinction on transactions. So whether the human is there with their physical card or whether they're entering it online or over the phone determines some of the sort of fraud risk associated with that transaction. It also determines some of the economics associated with that transaction. So it's a pretty important distinction when you're thinking through what type of payment you're going to accept or be processing. ISO 8583, this is the protocol used to transmit a lot of these messages. So we'll actually take a look at what one of these messages looks like and how lightweight it is and how it's able to actually move very quickly through all these different parties. And then the final piece is the BIN, so it's the bank identification number. And when you look at your card, the first 6 digits of your card are actually the BIN. And they link back to who that issuing bank actually is, and then that connects to the issuer processor as well. So I was actually having an interesting conversation yesterday with somebody from Visa who's in charge of determining which banks can actually be BIN sponsor banks. So that's an example of how these parties are working together. It's not that linear. There's a lot of governance, which can be cumbersome overhead, but also makes this sort of ecosystem work the way it does. Okay. So I'll do questions at the end, but also if you have questions in the middle, I just went through a lot of overview stuff. Now I'm going to move over to the transaction lifecycle. So talking through how a single transaction is moving across all these different parties and how that happens and what each company's role is in that. Okay, step 1, the card is swiped, tapped, or dipped at the point of sale. So you've walked into the merchant, you've agreed by either tapping or swiping at their point of sale, so their hardware device. So what's happening? So now this ISO 8583 message is created, and it basically bundles 3 types of information. The first is the card information. So when you did that swipe or tap, what have you, the PAN, CVV, and expiration date were taken off your card. Then there's the merchant information. So because that point of sale device knows where they are, in the setup of that device, you have the merchant information, and then you have the transaction information. So the biggest part of this is the amount, but it can also be the type of authorization. So is this a refund? Is this authorization? There's actually a lot of complexity there. So these 3 pieces of information are basically bundled into this ISO message. And then they're transmitted across this chain. The acquirer processor is really looking at which network should I send this message to. So they're trying to route all these messages that they're getting. The first digit of that PAN is basically what determines which network it should go to. And so they'll send it to Visa, MasterCard, what have you. Then the network will determine off the first 6 digits, that BIN, where they should send it in terms of issuer processor. And so at the end of this step 1, the issuer processor has received an ISO message. And that's where we're at the end of step 1. So the guts of an ISO message, for those of you who are curious, this is now kind of very deep in the weeds, but I think it's interesting how lightweight this message actually is. It's basically a bunch of fields and their values, and there's just a long mapping of what does field ID 18 actually stand for? It stands for the merchant category code. So 5542 is an automated fuel dispenser. So all of this ISO message information is then now, at this point in our transaction lifecycle, at the issuer processor. So the issuer processor then has a decision to make. So this is step 2. The transaction is authorized or declined. So I think we've all been there where we're standing at the point of sale, sort of waiting, and then our card is declined. It's a pretty awkward moment. A lot of different reasons for that. So one piece that I haven't talked about is all of this has to happen really fast. So if anybody is sleeping at the wheel in this whole chain, the transaction is basically automatically declined in most cases. And so that's one reason why you might have a decline. Another reason is that the issuer processor actually is applying logic at that point. So there are logic gates that may result in either approval or decline. So now the issuer processor basically runs this logic and determines, is the card active? Are there fraud signals that makes me want to decline this transaction? They may check, like if it's an online transaction, they may check whether the address matches the address of the consumer on file. So they have a lot of this information, and they are the logic gate in this whole chain. So the issuer processor basically comes to a decision. The kind of like second level complexity there is they can send back either just an approved decline. They can also send back optionally some other signals through to this chain. So that's sort of like if you're interested in the deeper dive, that can also happen. But for simplicity's sake, let's say approve or decline goes back, sends it to the network, sends it to the acquirer processor, all the way to this icon, which is me standing at a coffee shop waiting to see whether this card has worked. Yeah, do you want to ask a question? Yeah.
How quickly does this need to happen?
Yeah, I think it depends kind of who you ask. I think 3 seconds is pretty much a safe bet, or it'll be declined. There's basically some stuff that always happens, and so I think the full time span is 7 seconds, but really most of this has to happen in 3 seconds. So it's quick, and that's part of why this is a good consumer experience, right? If you were waiting for a long time, for your transaction to be put on a blockchain, for example, it's just not a usable experience. So this happens in a matter of a few seconds. The important piece to note here is no money has moved at this point. So a lot has happened, a lot of logic has happened, but no money has been moved. Generally, a hold has been placed on the funds of the user account, so you as a consumer can spend less, but you as a merchant actually don't have any additional money because there has been no transfer of funds into your account. Most of us have seen this. The transaction shows as pending in your statement or on your mobile app for your bank. So now step 3. So this is the piece where the merchant has to decide how much they want to be paid, which transactions they want to be paid for. If you've bought something from, say, Amazon and they put a $50 off, but you bought multiple objects, they only really can be paid for the ones that they've shipped. So they only want to clear transactions for the piece that has been shipped. So they have to go through and say, okay, I shipped a 1 box value $10, so that's how much I need to get paid today. So they're doing all that on the merchant side. And they have generally, although there are different ways of doing this, they're generally a batch of transactions submitted for payment daily. And there's like maybe a UI in their Square or Toast system that says, okay, these ones need to be cleared today. Then this basically routes through the whole system, and people are checking. We already went through this chain twice, right? So everybody should be keeping track of what's going on, and now they're checking. Okay, does this make sense for the merchant to be paid for these transactions? So now that that's been submitted, step 4 is settlement. The money actually moves, and this happens generally on a daily basis, but this is where the networks really come in and facilitate the movement of funds out of the issuing bank and into the merchant bank. And so it's not, a transfer for each $5 latte that I buy. It's actually an aggregate transfer. And so that's what we saw happen in the last step, is merchants are aggregating their transactions, and then across these different merchant banks and issuing banks, there's also an aggregation layer there. So then the network will actually move the money and provide everyone in this ecosystem with the network settlement file. And so this is the final step of reconciliation, which, one of the shocking things to me when I got into card payments was, man, reconciliation is really hard. Like, isn't this all happening automatically? Shouldn't everybody have the same source of truth? And because there's things like adding a tip, there's reversals, there's refunds, there's all kinds of edge cases here, reconciliation, can be very hard for say 0.1, 0.01% of transactions that just don't fit the mold of this general happy path. Okay, so I'll pause there. I have some special topics. I gave this same talk to our new hires recently, so my special topics are based on what they asked me. But I'll pause there for sort of questions on the overview of card payments and the transaction lifecycle. Yeah?
It occurs to me that obviously when you check out somewhere,
Yeah.
a lot of times you'll say, would you like to add a tip before they process the payment? And that's them actually adjusting the amount before they do that.
Yeah.
Has there been an effort on any side to kind of reduce those edge cases by essentially moving it up the pipeline a little bit?
Yeah, so when I think of edge cases, so like that's one example. The tip edge case is almost not an edge case anymore because it's pretty well understood. So there's an authorization message and then there's an advice message later that adjusts the amount. And then you have a settled value. So you basically have a pretty good sense of that. I think some of the edge cases happen when people are not doing exactly what they should be, for example. So one edge case I was looking at recently was a car rental agency that left an authorization on for 40 days and didn't clear it, right? And so you have these outstanding pieces that then don't make sense to other parties in this ecosystem. So I think there's some innovation there in the sense that like we looked at it and we're like, okay, we should figure out how to make sense of this for our customers. But I would say there's not, on the tip front, I think that is fairly well understood. Yeah, go ahead.
So what happens with approval in that process where like, okay, you swiped and now there's a charge? Can the charge then fail after it was initially approved?
Yeah.
Settlement time or?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call it failure as much as a reversal. So sometimes you will approve and then like, okay, they're actually out of coffee at this coffee shop and they do the reversal. So they may not settle, right? So actually in step 3, when they go to settle the transaction, they may not settle that because it basically negates with the reversal. So just because it's authorized doesn't mean that it will.
On the other side, can the bank say like, actually no, this money I thought was here, it's not here? Or like the tip was too high?
So that is not a special topic I added, but should have maybe added, which is chargebacks. So the actual way that this ends up working, because at the time of authorization, you're already checking like, does the person have money, right? So it's not a good funds problem that we're actually facing. It'll be wait, I didn't tip $100 on a $5 coffee, I tipped $1. So that would then require me to go in and say, I want to dispute this charge. That then has to flow through the ecosystem again.
So, but what if like I did tip $100, but I had $50 in my
Oh, like that authorization? That would potentially fail. So there's a system of like forced post. So this is like maybe getting a little too detailed for this talk, but there are these like, that is a good example of an edge case where somebody could force post. That's pretty rare, but it does happen. There's one other question, and then we can go, yeah? I don't know the answer to that, although I do think about this sometimes because it is possible, one of the things I'll talk about is virtual cards and this trend towards having a lot more card numbers. And so I could see one of the purposes actually being expanding the number of cards you can create on a bin range. So that would be my guess, but don't quote me on that. Although this presentation is being recorded, so I'm inherently being quoted on that. Okay, so that, any other questions? And then we'll go to like sort of my selection of special topics. Cool, okay. So the first one, it kind of alludes to this question is, people ask, one of Lithic's taglines is virtual, digital, and physical cards. But then people are like, so what should I use? Like, it's cool that you offer all of these things, but what should I actually do? The difference is virtual cards are basically the easiest to get out the door. So you can create these, you can send them, you can use them online, but it is online only. So while it's the simplest to create, it can also be the most limited in its use. Then the second piece is digital cards. So very similar to virtual cards, but these are capable of being added to your digital wallet. So now you can pay wherever tap is accepted. You now have that functionality, which increasingly is something that merchants are accepting. The additional wrinkle here for those of you looking to build card products is if you want to push provision. So what that means is, we're all probably checking into a flight pretty soon, and then you'll see that icon that says add to Apple Wallet. That push provisioning of, say, a credit card or a debit card, that requires approval by Apple or Google. So when you think of already how many approvals you probably need in this payment ecosystem, you can't put whatever you want on the card art. You have to basically make sure everybody is okay with everything you do. There is a lot of that in this card payment ecosystem. You are adding two pretty big players that add non-trivial complexity to this piece. Not insurmountable, but it is one thing to think about. Then the third piece is physical cards. I say, like a soon-to-be-dead art form, but physical cards, printing and shipping, it's still like a real problem, especially if people don't give you the right address, people need you to resend it, people want to track where their card is. It can be a whole different set of complexity that, especially for folks who are digital first or vertical SaaS or neobank, may not have dealt with actually mailing anything to anyone. It's surprisingly hard. It can also require high numbers. So for those of you getting started with wanting to do a pilot, wanting to show traction, wanting to do a friends and family beta, it can require some high number of cards that you need to print. And then the third point is sort of a nuanced point, which is it requires alignment with a digital card and virtual card strategy. So I recently got a new credit card, and I wanted to add it to my digital wallet, but I actually couldn't do that until a week later when it was shipped to me and I basically turned it on, right? But that's an annoying experience for me as a consumer. Oh, can't touch the mic. For me as the consumer, because I want to start using it right away. I want to buy my flights on this card. I want to use it to tap to pay for coffee. So there is some alignment required there of what does your user actually want? Could you get away with just offering them a digital card and not messing with the physical card? There's still a lot of folks who want physical cards, so this is a real knowing who you're building for type of problem. But all three of them have pretty compelling use cases. Okay, then the other question that I got recently when I did this talk for new hires is like, okay, so what is Interchange? How much is it? How much does everybody make off of the Interchange? And it's just incredibly complicated. But the main factors that go into determining Interchange are the card type. So this is a snippet of Visa's rate table as of April 2021. And this is one snippet out of a many-page PDF that I was looking at. And the rate table, the things to look at here are at the very top, you have consumer prepaid. So this rate table is for a specific type of card, and that could be debit, credit, consumer, commercial. So that piece can change quite a bit. Then the merchant category matters. So I talked about this before of, if you're on the merchant side, what you're designated as determines how much interchange, that merchant discount rate, you will pay. So you can see here, the restaurants, supermarkets, all of these different merchant categories then result in a different sort of fee table. The other piece is the issuer status. So this is based on regulation, but the issuer bank size also determines whether they're exempt or regulated. And then the final piece is card present versus non-present. So this is another reason that the glossary term was so important, is that it actually ends up determining a lot of the economics. So you can actually see that last line here, retail key entry prepaid. So this is, this is when, for whatever reason, systems aren't working and somebody that you're trying to purchase from, that retail associate, is typing in your card number. That is going to result in a higher interchange. So that level of nuance, I think, is pretty interesting. Yeah.
There are other ones like that with like the zip code,
Yeah. So there's there's two types of this, is like fraud shows up in two ways. One could be higher interchange, right? Like if there's a higher fraud risk, like in this case, it may be a higher interchange rate. The other one is who is responsible for the chargeback. So this is like a additional sort of nuance here, but depending on how, if you're buying something online and you do certain checks, you as the merchant may be exempt from having to pay for chargebacks because you sort of did your part and you checked as much as you could. You checked the address, or you did two-factor authentication. 3DS in Europe is a big piece of this that exempts merchants from chargeback liability. Anyway, it can show up in two ways. It can either be the chargeback or the interchange. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have examples of what are the categories for high exchanges, fintech exchange versus the lower category versus the lower?
Yeah, so I think your question is basically what results in high interchange versus what results in low interchange?
Which category? The merchant category?
Yeah, so the full rate tables are online. The lowest ones tend to be gas, grocery, all your essentials. The highest ones end up being travel and some of the more niche merchant categories. Those I've seen be higher. I think the general trends are commercial tends to be higher than consumer, credit tends to be higher than debit, and then the exempt is higher than regulated. So that's an easy way to think about it. But it's maybe I'm a payment nerd now, but like this is a super interesting PDF on Visa's website if you ever want to take a look. Yeah, go ahead.
How does so on the issuer status, how does it determine if you're exempt or regulated?
Yeah, so this is something called a Durbin amendment, if you want to read more about sort of the legal piece. It's basically dependent on the assets that you have. So if you're a big bank, over $10 billion in assets, I believe, you are regulated. If you're a small bank, and a lot of these BIN-sponsored banks are under 10 billion in assets, that means you are exempt from that regulation.
Does it apply to all transactions or just?
Yeah, so for basically all transactions have some combo of these things, and then that determines the interchange that will be applied to that transaction alone.
But on the issuer, exempt versus regulated, it's just debit, right?
Right, exactly, for debit. Yeah, go ahead.
Is the chargeback risk that you were talking about a second ago the reason that Amex is not as broadly distributed as one of the other issuers?
Man, that is a complicated question. So I think actually the distribution method has a lot more to do with how this all came to play, right? So multiple decades ago, I talked about the acquiring side, people actually going door to door at mom and pop shops and getting them to accept card transactions. So I actually think that's how Visa and MasterCard became these bigger networks than Amex. Amex is an interesting case because they're kind of a closed loop system, what is referred to. So they actually own multiple parts of this ecosystem versus Visa and MasterCard partner. The other piece of that is you often find that merchants don't accept Amex. Amex, because they own this whole thing, they are the issuer, they're pay the interchange, their interchange is higher. So that's sort of why the rewards are higher. That's why it's merchants tend to not want to accept it because they will pay more for that. I think that was one more question. No?
Can you
Oh, yeah.
describe a little bit of the difference between commercial credit and consumer and how that relates to maybe fraud or chargebacks or just some of the key differentiators?
Yeah, so I don't think it's as much, in general, people think of consumers being higher fraud than commercial. I don't think there's huge differences actually between like how all these things happen. Like a commercial can still have chargebacks. The main distinction is who is using the card. What's the purpose of the card use? So if you have a contractor going out and buying stuff at Home Depot for their business, that's commercial. If they're going to buy it for their own personal pet project, that's consumer. And then that changes the interchange. So it's like not a black and white distinction at all, and then it determines a lot of the economics. So it is definitely a fascinating factor of this whole ecosystem. Yeah.
Any advanced interchange optimization techniques that you could share maybe beyond level 2, level 3? You mentioned 3
Yeah,
a little bit more popular here from the chargeback liability.
right, right.
I've also heard about network tokenization possibly being able to pass through, again, when you're conforming to all the best practices and
Yeah.
fraud deterrence, perhaps there's an opportunity to benefit on the interchange.
Yeah, so it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? So if you're the merchant and you just don't want liability for the chargebacks, then all the things that you said are absolutely applicable. You might also work with an issuer processor that has some fraud checks built in. You might do some more transaction monitoring if it's more of a risk approach that you want to take. On the interchange optimization, it kind of feels like a dirty word there. But these are the factors that you would look at, right? These are the factors that determine interchange. So you would be looking at, can I offer a credit card? If you're on the issuing side, you want to make interchange. So you're actually trying to increase interchange. If you're on the acquiring side, you want to decrease interchange. So if you're on the acquiring side, you want to pick a merchant category code. And again, all within compliant bounds, but you want to make sure your merchant category code is optimized for that. I'll talk about innovation in the ecosystem. You may want to work with a more innovative acquirer processor. So they may be able to route to the right network that might have lower interchange. So that's on the merchant side. If you're on the issuing side, these are the factors you look at. And there's not a ton of wiggle room here. You have to do commercial if it's commercial. You have to do consumer if it's consumer, et cetera.
But I've heard, up to 10 additional basis points of interchange reduction in the future on Visa's network tokenization technique.
Okay.
Years ago, 3 secure card programs by Visa also passed through additional discounts on interchange.
Interesting.
If you conform to,
Interesting.
secure.
Yeah.
Again, I think they're moving away from some of this.
Yeah.
And I just didn't know with your experience if you've seen
Yeah.
advanced capabilities.
Yeah. Well, it's a good point because one of the other things that I was talking about earlier is how this network incentivizes certain behavior, right? And so Visa or MasterCard, they're in a very good position because they're setting these rates to incentivize what they want. So whether they want merchants to be implementing 3D Secure, they want them to be checking certain things, they can use interchange as a way to incentivize.
So stay close with card brands.
Yeah. And like this is April 16, 2021. These things change all the time. Like it's not like they said it once. Other questions? I can move to the next special topic. What changes when you go credit versus debit? So on one hand, everything. On the other hand, nothing. So the nothing piece is it's still the same transaction lifecycle we just walked through, right? Just because the bin is considered a credit bin or a debit bin, it's still going to go through this dual message system. But on the other side, everything changes because you're offering, in the consumer case, consumer credit. And that is a very highly regulated space. And that means a lot more overhead in terms of the terms you need to show your consumers, the things that you need to abide by when you're offering credit to an individual. And then on the back end, the ledger accounting does get more complicated. So you have to keep track of interest, partial payments, things that don't really apply to the debit use case. All right, and then I think there's my final special topic, which is innovation in the ecosystem. So this is going back to my first point of like, why is this even interesting? On the acquiring side, we've seen in the last decade or two a lot of innovation with, Stripe, Square, all of these folks making it very easy to accept payments. So that I won't talk too much about. I think we're all kind of on the same page of what a big success those folks are. Now on the acquirer processor side, this is to your question of like, how can you optimize things? You have folks like TabaPay who are coming in and doing some more analytics, doing some interesting routing of payments. Because as we went through before, the acquirer processor is responsible for routing the payment to the right network, right? So there's some things that can be done there. They can also do some optimizations to make sure the payment goes through. So they're actually at this conference, so I was talking to them about what they're doing. And then in the middle, Visa and MasterCard and other networks, they're also innovating, and they're thinking through, how do you do level 2, level 3 data? How can you have SKU level data, and how can this be passed through? Also, how can you reduce fraud? So they can sort of incentivize things to make the ecosystem better as well. Issuer processor, nearest and dearest to my heart. That's where we're at Lithic. There's two main pieces here. One is the logic, right? We saw how the issuer processor runs logic to approve or deny a transaction. There's a lot more to be done there and a lot more customization that you can actually do at that point. And then the other is ease of onboarding. I was talking to somebody yesterday who's gonna give as part of her talk, issuing is still really hard, is like one of the themes coming out of her talk. I agree, like it's still really hard, much harder than it is to accept payments. It's difficult and there are hurdles to issuing cards. That's really what we're trying to do at Lithic is address that and other folks as well. But I think the innovation will come in additional functionality and then ease of onboarding, ease of use, ease of actually getting the card into your consumer's hands. So that's a little bit of an overview of innovation in the ecosystem. I think it's a good point to take any final questions coming out of this talk. Yeah? Yeah. So a few of the use cases, so this is like the piece I mentioned about maybe the funnest part of my job is figuring out what people are building with this new technology. One is more niche neobanking is really interesting. So if you think a few decades ago, to offer cards, to have this whole thing up and running was a huge hurdle. And so you had the major Chase, Bank of America who could do this, and they needed to appeal to a mass market to basically recoup all the costs they put into infrastructure. Now you can start a neobank quite quickly, and you can start offering cards. Like this is a core functionality of having a neobank is offering some way to spend on a card. And so we're seeing a lot of that, of demographic specific neobanking is one trend we've seen. The other one that has been pretty interesting is innovative ways to split spending. So we've seen people, because the step 4, the settlement, is somewhat disjointed from all the other steps. You can do all the other parts of the transaction, and then you can figure out who pays for it, right? And so one of the pieces of that is, say you have a couple that is splitting expenses. You could split expenses on certain categories at certain percentages between the two people. So that's kind of something I don't think I would have ever thought of, but somebody is building that and finding a use case for that. So those are a couple. Yeah. So Stripe is actually on the acquiring side, but they are now probably in every piece of this pretty soon. So Stripe kind of has started doing everything, but when most people think of Stripe, you would put them over here in merchant point of sale. Like that's where you enter your card details, and then they would be doing, in a lot of cases now, the merchant terminal and the acquire processor can be the same person, or they're wrapping somebody. So it's a close relationship oftentimes. Yeah, go ahead.
I see you're probably familiar with the brand built around merchant blocking.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you can talk about having other companies like fintechs in the authentication flow for declining transactions. And if you see that as something that is valuable to consumers.
Yeah, so this is actually something that we offer called auth stream access for our customers. So, there's sort of two ways of doing this. Either we make the decision for you and you can give us some rules to follow, or you make the decision real time, each transaction, apply your own logic to it. The models are good fits for different fintechs, right? If you have the systems in place to make a decision on every transaction in under a couple seconds, flow this all the way through the system, that might be a great place. And then you might be keeping a merchant descriptor list. You can write custom logic. You can change that however you want on literally a per transaction level. So I definitely think there's a need for that, and each model is a fit for different type of folk. Okay, I don't know whether I'm out of time. I think I probably am. But please come find me. We're hosting a happy hour tonight, 6 p.m. at Ocean Prime, if you just want to come hang out. We're also hiring across basically all roles, in case that wasn't clear. And then please just come say hi, and hope this was helpful.